Well, the United States Capitol was on, quote, high alert yesterday. The National Guard was ready, fencing all in place, security perimeters fortified. The House of Representatives canceled its sessions for the day. This was all done because, as the media constantly reminded us in the days leading up to yesterday, March 4th, there was supposed to be a threat of right-wing terrorist violence. The right-wing MAGA domestic terrorists had threatened to try to overtake the Capitol building on March 4th, we were told. And this was all part of, again, this is what we're told, all part of some plot that, as I understand it, involved the belief that March 4th was the true inauguration day. And on that day, Donald Trump would rise from the ashes to his rightful throne and call on his followers to also rise up in vengeance and destroy his adversaries. Now, the strange thing is that I never heard about this conspiracy theory and this plot from any actual right-wingers. I never heard any right-winger talk about this. I never saw any right-winger post about this. I don't know of any right-wingers who know of any right-wingers who talked about that or posted about that. This was a far-reaching, widely believed conspiracy theory on the right that nobody on the right seemed to be aware of. Very strange. Yet it justified the further military occupation of D.C. and the drama and theatrics of the House of Representatives shutting down in a panic. And then March 4th came yesterday, and it went, and nothing happened. There was, you may have noticed, no attack, no insurrection, nothing. Now, this could be because the right-wing insurrectionists have invisibility cloaks and actually did invade the Capitol, but nobody saw them. And if the terrorists have that kind of technology, then we're definitely in trouble. I mean, we have to admit, right? But the other possibility, something we should at least consider, is that there was never any plot at all. That this was all an invention, something that existed only in the fevered imagination of the left and the media. I mean, we certainly can't rule out either possibility. I mean, the invisibility cloak thing is technically possible, but I tend to think that the latter is probably the case. There was never any plot. If there were any QAnon people who believed that March 4th was the real inauguration day or whatever, it was a small smattering of them and not nearly enough to justify the continued military occupation of our nation's capital. So where do we go from here? There was supposed to be right-wing violence on Inauguration Day. There was no violence. Then they said that there would be the violence on March 4th, and that didn't happen either. The military occupation of D.C. is starting to remind me of the 15 days to slow the spread thing. Something with a definitive end date originally, but then suddenly becomes ambiguous and endless. They put a certain measure in place for a particular reason. Then when that reason no longer applies, they find another one. And that's why we can't expect the military to go home and the fencing to come down now that another predicted right-wing insurrection turned out to be a dud. There are reports today that the United States Capitol Police Department has requested an extension of the National Guard presence in the Capitol for another 30 days. Or rather 60 days, another 2 months. Another 2 months of the U.S. Capitol under military occupation. Why? For what reason? More threats, of course. But what threats? Well, you heard about the threats on Inauguration Day that didn't amount to anything. And you heard about the threats on March 4th that didn't amount to anything. Now get ready for the next big thing. The next big hype. March 20th. You're probably going to be hearing a lot about March 20th in the coming days. Not from right-wing insurrectionists or QAnon conspiracy theorists, but from the media allegedly reporting what those other groups are allegedly saying. So here's the Newsweek headline. It says, QAnon theorists switch date to March 20th after no Trump inauguration, call the fourth false flag. Then the article goes on to talk about how QAnon people branded March 4th a false flag and never planned to do anything on that day, which again raises the question as to why they canceled the House session and they stood on high alert. If now the media is telling us that, oh yeah, well the QAnon people said that March 4th was never a thing. But where does this March 20th date come from? Well, in the Newsweek article, you have to go all the way to the end of that article, and then you find this. Here's what it says. Some QAnon supporters seem to rebrand the March 4th conspiracy in the wake of community suspicion. While two individuals affiliated with the false theories simply suggested that Trump's inauguration would take place sometime in the spring, one man, identified as Ken, told Washington Post reporter Dave Weigel, that the former president, quote, will be inaugurated again on March 20th in comments over the weekend. Ken also believes that Trump is still in full command of the military and Biden is acting as president as a ruse while the Pope and others are rounded up, according to Weigel. The upcoming date will mark the 167th anniversary of the Republican Party's founding. Former members of the Whig Party are said to have technically established the GOP during a meeting in Ripon, Wisconsin on March 20th, 1854. Oh yes, March 20th, 1854, the technical founding of the Republican Party. Isn't that a date that all of us right-wingers know so well and care so much about? I talk to conservatives all the time. I say, what are you doing for March 20th? Big day. It's when the Whig Party technically formed Republican Party. Big stuff. So that's it. A guy named Ken. Newsweek is pushing in its headline a new date for an insurrection based on something that a guy named Ken told another guy. That's really it. I'm not cherry picking and no, that's it in the Newsweek article. That's all they got. They got a guy named Ken. They don't even explain anything about Ken. Who is Ken? Is he from a forum? Is he from Reddit? Is he just like, did this Washington Post reporter stumble across this guy on a park bench somewhere? Is it his neighbor, his uncle, his cousin? Just this is what Ken says. This is how journalism works in the modern age. It works namely by trying to conjure things into reality by reporting them as a reality before they are a reality. The game here is completely transparent. The media wants some kind of violent right-wing demonstration, and so it is itself inventing conspiracy theories that it hopes the right will adopt. And even if the media is ultimately disappointed and the violence never materializes, still the threat, the entirely invented threat, is useful enough on its own. Useful to guys like Congressman Jamal Bowman, who was on MSNBC recently explaining why the city has to remain fortified even after all this. Here's what he says.
What do you feel, or how do you feel about the decision to extend the security perimeter and the presence of the National Guard at the Capitol?
It's something we have to do, unfortunately, because the threat of white nationalists and white supremacists is real. You know, they are continuing to organize and galvanize across this country. There are many examples of them infiltrating law enforcement across this country. So we have to make sure the Capitol is protected and our elected officials are protected. But we also have to be proactive. You know, we cannot take the threat of white nationalism lightly. You know, over the last several years, they've made their presence felt, whether it's the Tree of Life Synagogue shooting, the Christchurch shooting, which happened overseas, as well as the AME Church shooting, and then obviously the January 6th insurrection. We have to do everything we can to protect ourselves and protect the Capitol, but we also have to be proactive in dealing with the issue of white nationalism in a very serious way.
Did you catch that? We have to do everything we can to protect ourselves. A politician saying that the government has to do everything it can to protect him. Sure, I mean, he's asking to be protected from a non-existent threat. Even so, talk about saying the quiet part out loud. Do everything you can to protect me. No, in fact, Jamal, the government should not do everything it can to protect you. Not at all. There's a whole lot it can do that it shouldn't do. It's doing some of those things right now. Yes, the government can fortify the nation's capital and permanently militarize it to protect politicians, to protect itself, but it shouldn't. But this is how Bowman and his Democrat cohorts see it. Do everything to protect him, and almost nothing to protect regular American citizens, his constituents, from violent BLM rioting in our cities or from the ordinary, everyday violence and bloodshed that wreaks havoc in those same cities. But look, none of this means that our elected representatives lack courage. I don't want you to think that. It would be unfair of me not to make note of Democratic Representative Al Green, who did demonstrate unparalleled courage and heroism yesterday in the midst of the attack by invisible or possibly non-existent insurrectionists. Here's the Hill with that report.
Representative Al Green is sending a message to QAnon and right-wing extremist threats by sitting on the Capitol steps on Thursday, the date authorities warned militia groups were potentially planning another breach of the building. He told The Hill, quote, "I want to make a statement to let people know, those who would threaten those of us who cherish this freedom that we have here, that we refuse to allow those threats to negate our freedom." Capitol Police and the FBI have cautioned that militia groups that took part in the deadly insurrection at the Capitol on January 6, when a group of Trump supporters attempted to disrupt the certification of the Electoral College votes, had drafted plans for a second attack on March 4th.
Wow. Wow. The bravery. He is sitting on the steps behind a barbed wire fence, patrolled by armed National Guardsmen, and staring down a crowd that consists of media members and a handful of pedestrians who happen to be walking by. Truly, the world has never seen courage such as this. For this man to sit in what is right now the safest place on earth, in spite of the alleged threats of a handful of nutty troll accounts on the internet, well, I, for one, am stunned. Stunned. Sure, it takes more courage to simply walk down the street in Chicago, a lot more actually, than to do what he did, but still. Let's not focus on any of that. Let's focus on him, which is what he wants us to do. Very inspiring, very courageous. Listen, hit that subscribe button right now. Do it right now. I thank you for your compliance. It is somewhat appreciated.